Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of CX Conversations. Today I'm very excited because we're talking to ourselves. We've got the Experience Director of Candyspace, Jonathan Kelly here. He's worked in product and digital product for many, many years. He can tell you about that. And we're here to talk about how we build digital products loved by everyone. Jonathan, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Why don't you tell us a bit about your experience?
Sure, yeah. So I've been working for Candyspace for almost 15 years now, actually, but my digital product experience has been built over a number of different disciplines and different kind of clients. And my passion really is about customer experience and trying to strive to get the best possible customer experience that we can. And the way that we really do that is by understanding the mindsets and getting really under the skin of what's important to customers. And that's something that over years, I guess, has become more commonplace in the industry, where thinking back to years back when I first started would be more around sort of the look and feel of a product, and now it's much more about how it works. So that's where my passion is, and that's what we try to bring.
Right, let's get into that then. So
Sure.
You've helped many of our clients, many different businesses across many different sectors build and develop and continue to evolve digital products. What are the most important things a business needs to consider when building those products?
Yeah. So I think from my perspective and from my experience, it's around, as I said, trying to understand what's important to a customer. I think when a business embarks upon a digital product and trying to build it to come to life, the first thing that is natural for a business to do is to focus on what's important to them and those business goals, which of course is important. What I try and do and what my team tries to do is to try to see how we can balance that with what's important to the user. So from a product design perspective, the most successful products that we've ever built have been where there's a real harmony and a value exchange between that business goal and that customer value, and trying to have something that will solve a real customer problem and in turn, deliver business value through that interaction. So really starting with the customer and trying to understand what's important to them and try to understand, are we solving a real problem and what's the heart of that problem? And then trying to identify, if you're solving something for your customer, how can then that translate into business value? And trying to identify that value exchange, I think, is where a key point to start.
It makes sense, but I imagine there must always be some sort of tension between customer need, business objectives, and an organization's own technology capabilities. How do you balance that tension into creating something that's going to be effective and hits the expectations of all of those parts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think from there's a few techniques that we have that will help to prioritize, the value of things and to balance that with the complexity. And I think with always what we'll try to do is to try to focus in on where the most value is, and we have some different activities that we'll run in terms of value versus complexity scoring, prioritization frameworks like RICE framework, etc. That will help us to really identify the needs of a business and the needs of a customer, and then it's about sort of cherry picking what's going to deliver you the most value, and trying to be led by that to make sure that you're solving real problems that are going to make a difference.
For the uninitiated, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about what some of those exercises involve?
Yeah, sure. So from a prioritization perspective, we have some different frameworks. There are many different frameworks out there, but RICE is one that really works for us, which is where we start to break down the reach. So when we think about a requirement in a specific platform, we first start by how many people will this requirement reach? So how many people will it touch? How many people will interact with this? So for example, if it's something that's really core to your proposition, it's something that's the core journey that everyone's going to touch, then obviously it will have a higher score for that reach. And if it's something that might be an edge case or something that isn't used by as many people, then that would have a lower score. So the reach is that fundamental first piece. Then we have the impact. So if this feature was released, what kind of impact it will have, and that's where we start to think about the impact to the user and also the impact to the business. And we assign a score for that for the impact. For the confidence, how much confidence do we have in this thing if it was to go live? What's our confidence in it being a success? And then the effort is obviously the important one, which is directly associated, usually with cost and how many people and how long will it take to bring this feature to life. So looking at those aspects, what we try to do is have a more of a scientific way of breaking down a feature and looking at it objectively. With that framework, which forces you to say, okay, each feature is scored with the same framework, so they are, there's no bias within it, and we're not using our own, our own assumptions. We're being led by data to inform those decisions. So I find with those kind of things as well, often when we're working with, big clients that have lots of different stakeholders that may all have their specific their specific goals within the product at their own departmental level. We find these kind of frameworks are good for objectively looking things, trying to remove people's biases and trying to look at all of the requirements in an equal weighting to be able to understand like what is the actual best requirement to go forward, what's going to deliver the most value to everyone.
It makes sense, and I know you've worked on products for big, complex global organisations where I imagine there are multiple stakeholders, each with their own remit and desires for the product. Is there an element of having to bring them on the journey, and how have you gone about that?
Yeah, each business is different, and different businesses will, work in different ways, different levels of seniority. I think where we've had the most success is where the teams are really bought into the proposition, and having buy-in at a senior level is always where we have the most success. But we have also had to go on the journey of trying to bring people along and trying to convince senior leadership or budget holders or other people of the importance or the value that a product can bring. What we found really, really useful is to, first of all, to try to understand and to get to the heart of why we're doing what we're doing. So, for example, like clearly identifying an issue or a problem that exists at the moment. So like, again, what is that problem we're trying to solve, which could be a customer problem, could be a business problem, but really trying to articulate, okay, what's the pain we're currently experiencing, and can we try to put a value onto that, or can we attribute sort of the severity of this thing? So, if we know what the pain is and we know how much pain it's causing, there might be a monetary value attributed to that as well, which I think as soon as we get into the monetary value is where certainly some of the senior stakeholders start to take a bit more notice and becomes a bit more tangible. And then once we've identified that, then we'll try to understand what is the value of us potentially making that change. And I think, these kind of clearly benchmarking an existing product, for example, before you actually overhaul it, and then being able to track that, and then over time being able to demonstrate clearly the impact that you've had is usually where we were able to bring stakeholders on that journey. But what I would certainly say is that it's really important to be data driven and to be able to understand the data that you have at the moment and understand what the benchmark is of what you're trying to change, and then to track that and to be very, very rigorous around the metrics that you're tracking along the journey to be able to clearly demonstrate the success that you're having and the impact that the product's having.
In scenarios where we're helping our clients to replace a legacy or an existing digital product, how does the concept of an MVP or a minimum viable product apply in that case? Because surely customers are already used to a whole set of features.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think the way I would approach it is not as an MVP kind of has to be cut and dry, which it completely switches from one to another. So you could think of it more as like an MVP phase, where there might be a phase of MVP work where there's a transition, and within that transition there might be some functionality that changes. We'd always try to focus on the core functionality that's the most valuable, and to see how maybe within that MVP phase we transition some features. Some features may well stay on the old legacy technology if that's appropriate. If it's not, then we would look to see how we can do that in the smoothest way possible. But with all of these, I would prioritize, I'd be led by data. So understand through the usage data, which features are users using the most, which is delivering the most value, and try to think of it like rolling out incrementally. But I guess the common misconception is that an MVP has to be cut and dry, and you have to switch from this one switched off, that one switched on. Whereas actually, there are different ways where you can phase out different technologies in a more of a smooth way, especially if there's a lot of complexity and it's not really realistic to just build everything from scratch. So I think of it more of like an MVP phase that might go over a couple of phases like that.
Okay. It wouldn't be a conversation in 2025 unless we mentioned AI. Yeah. How is AI helping your team to inform the way we go about building and evolving digital products?
Yeah. I think, from my perspective, I find, AI really exciting. There's so much transformation that's happening in all different sectors. I think from a design perspective specifically, it's really starting to proliferate into a lot of the tools that we use. For example, Figma's a big one that we're using, every day, and prompting is starting to sort of get into every facet of all the different products. From a design perspective specifically, I think that there's maybe a little way to go for the technology to really sort of replicate the same standard of sort of a designer to be able to create components. I would say for the real building blocks that are very, very well known, patterns like login, sign up, things like that, where the user experience is so well defined, you don't need to try to think of a new exciting way to log in if it's just an email and sign-in password kind of input box. I think things like those, actually, AI tools can really, really quickly, through a prompt, can create a screen like that, which is a basis. And those kind of things in terms of getting more speed and efficiency are really important because, as we all know, there's always pressure from clients to be able to do things in the most leanest, efficient and cost-effective way, and we'll always try to see opportunities. What I would say is that where I've seen AI be really, really transformational for our team is stuff which are sort of automating more manual tasks and maybe things that aren't the direct skill set of a designer. So as an example, one of the tools that is built into Figma now, which is really, really great, and a lot of you guys probably see this in ChatGPT, is that if you're building a component or a screen, quite often in our use cases, there will be we'll have to use placeholder copy. So often we'll be using lorem ipsum. Lorem ipsum has been the key one for years and years and years. We have lorem ipsum, but of course, from a client perspective, it's quite difficult to relate to the copy if it's got lorem ipsum in there. So now within Figma, you've got a plugin where you can just give a slight description of what you're trying to do, and it will write a paragraph of copy in a couple of seconds. So what we've done there is we're using AI to be able to make our designs more interpretable and more realistic from a client to be able to interpret. But we're not having to invest in a copywriter, and we're not having to waste our time to write the copy ourselves. So I think with those kind of use cases, there's kind of an interesting where we're getting some additional functionality that's not our core skill set that we can just be supercharged by AI. So I think those use cases are really interesting. Certainly, we're looking into stuff like audits. Accessibility audits are a good one, where there's a lot of stuff to be interpreted with alt tags and all the different stuff behind the scenes, and sort of an AI machine learning algorithm can look through those things and come up with some examples or some things that need to be changed potentially as well, which are really, really good. I would say, from my perspective, that it feels, certainly within design, that there's always going to be a human intervention needed. So I think AI can supercharge us so far, but for me, I feel that still that human intervention is really, really valuable. And I think that at the moment, probably one of the things to consider is that it's not quite clear at the moment where the data is sitting. For example, if I'm working on a project for a client where we are very confidential, there might be NDAs, etc. If we are sort of having our work created by AI, like, who owns the IP to this, which is important to our clients, and I think that those kind of things at the moment are still things that aren't very well defined, and maybe give clients not as much confidence to dive headfirst in. And I think there will always be a level of client that is happy to have their work created by AI, and probably happy for the reduced cost or whatever the efficiency is, to say that their work won't be unique. But certainly with a lot of our clients are demanding more bespoke, and a lot of the complexity that we have requires a lot of understanding of a business use case, that background research, which makes it more difficult for the AI to kind of interpret without giving over all that data and that company's secrets. So I think over time these things will probably improve, and actually when there's a bit more transparency about who owns the data, or potentially whether businesses can have their own kind of agent, your own instance where that the data resides with you, then maybe clients will be more comfortable with us doing that. But certainly a thing that's changing almost every week and is really, really interesting, and something that we're continuing to watch.
Yeah, it's a really interesting take on it. I think what AI is enabling us to do now is amplify the expertise of our humans. And that expertise is still really, really valuable, but the tools that, as you say, every week are improving in terms of their sort of speed, efficiency and sophistication is allowing our experts to deliver their expertise even more effectively.
Yeah.
As an aside, the first time I ever saw Lorem Ipsum, I had to go to the IT guy and say my computer was broken. It seems to be putting all the text in Latin.
Yeah.
Final question, John. So if you think about your current role and looking back to Jonathan Kelly at the start of his career, what advice would you go back and give to him?
Yeah. I think something that has changed, I said, over time, and certainly over my career, is the sort of the rise of UX and the rise of the user. So certainly I would say that probably when I started my career, there wasn't so much focus on the user, and that's something that I feel has transformed our way of delivering products and to make them much more relevant and much more impactful. So I would say to think about the user more and think about less about what I think or what it looks like, and think about what the problem we're trying to solve. So trying to get to the heart of that problem and try to understand the user more would be something that I would certainly try to encourage myself to do. I think another thing would be around not being afraid to fail. I think obviously when you're new in the industry, when you're trying to do something, you're trying to do good work, you're trying to impress your colleagues or a client, etc. Then it can be daunting to get something wrong. Whereas actually, what I feel, and I would try to instill in a lot of my team, that actually, failure is learning, and not being afraid to fail, but failing fast. Failing and trying to take the learnings from that and to build something better in the future is something that I've always taken, and sort of try to encourage my team to try and take risks, to try and solve a problem in a more interesting way, not necessarily go down the easy route because you're scared to fail, but try to see if you can make a difference and try and do something different, and not have that burden of being afraid to get something wrong. So certainly not being afraid to fail is something that I think will make us all a bit more brave and potentially push things forward.
I think there's a nice quote from Nelson Mandela. I won't get it exactly right, but it was something like, "I never fail. I either learn or I win."
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
John, thanks so much. It's been really insightful talking to you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.